Hi, folks. I'm Don Meisner, and I want to welcome you to UpNorthNY Chat. And I'm here today with Dave Swanson and a new friend of ours, Scott, who came to be an acquaintance of ours through this very chat. And one of Scott's dreams in life is to catch a northern pike or even a muskie on a fly rod with a fly. And it's something that both Dave and I have done up here, and we've helped other people to do that. So that's going to be the nature of what we talk about. We're lucky to have Scott with us today. And Scott, it is something that I can understand how you would desire to do this. And, for a lot of people, catching a muskie is just a huge thing, no matter what they catch it with. The fish of 1,000 casts and so forth. But muskie and northern pike are closely related. They have a lot of the same habits, and they will respond to the same type of fishing. And so years ago, when I was doing rod and reel stream sight, and I'm saying years ago, it became a desire for me because I'd never caught one on a fly, and I grew up only fishing trout in the Genesee River in Allegheny County, New York. And I will tell you that my first attempt to do this, the one thing I had was Atlantic salmon tandem streamers. And I don't know if you know what I'm talking about, the tandems, but the tandem streamers. And this person near Glens Falls was making these streamers, and they made a bright orange one for me because I don't think Atlantic salmon fishermen have just a solid orange tandem streamer that they use for salmon. But it was of that design with the salmon hooks and so forth. And I used to go in the St. Lawrence River at the time and troll either by hand with oars or with paddles or with a trolling motor along the shore in the spring with my fly rod with sinking fly line out way behind the boat, just slowly going along with a tandem streamer. And believe me, northern pike will really respond to that. So as the years have gone on, we've had different experiences, but I know that Dave and I, knowing that this is something you would like to do, and knowing that there's opportunities to do that, probably any place there's northerns, but we're lucky enough, we've got a lot of different waters with northern pike up here in the North Country, in St. Lawrence County. I'm sure that in this coming year, we can make that happen for you. But tell us why this has become sort of not a passion, but a real deep desire for you to catch a northern or a muskie on a fly rod.
Yeah, well, preserving fisheries is important. The environment and I grew up like you as a trout fisherman, and those times of summer, puts too much pressure on the fish. I believe the trout, the heat, the less oxygenation in the water, so on and so forth. So I've really shifted my mindset over the last few years to target warm water species. And obviously the thrill of catching a 30, 40, 50-inch fish on a fly rod is just exhilarating, especially when you've caught large salmon, which I have, or steelhead or things of that nature. So A is to be able to catch a different species, another species, and some of the top predators on the food chain, plus protect the trout during the summer and just being able to experience the variety and just learning new techniques. And I also like to, I'm a biologist and chemist by education in my undergraduate degree, becoming a physician later, but, so I study a lot and I get into the biology of things and the life cycles. And, I've looked at the books from Barry Reynolds on pike on the fly and mastering pike on the fly. And I've talked to John McMillan out west about steelhead and things of that nature. So meeting people like you, this is, why I've gravitated this way.
Well, I will tell you, in response to that, and meeting people like me, I am not an expert at catching pike or muskies on a fly, but I've been fortunate enough and lucky enough to, I have quite a few experiences where that's possible. And I know, Dave, you please jump in here because this is something that we're all doing together here. So, Dave, I know you might have some ideas on this that you'd like to share with Scott?
Well, one of the things that struck me as you spoke, Scott, you talked about the warm weather and the impact on the fish, and the one thing I think I probably should warn you about is that muskies are somewhat sensitive
Yes.
to the heat, and they're a fish that does exhaust themselves, I guess is the best way to describe it, to the point of in some cases not being able to recover. So you kind of have to be careful in midsummer with the muskie as well. And Don and I both experienced periods of 15 to 20 minutes to recover a fish to be able to release him. I think in all of my time on the water, I've only ever had one fish that didn't make it, that I'm confident didn't make it. I mean, I knew it didn't make it. The other ones swam away and appeared to be okay, but I did have one that didn't make it. And again, that was a midsummer fish, and he just exhausted himself to the point of not being able to recover. So I think pike are less susceptible. Now, Don, you may have thoughts on that, but I've always felt that they were somewhat hardier than the muskie.
And I don't know. I know that in general, pike are smaller. So most of the pike you catch are going to be a bit smaller. And usually the bigger a fish is, the older it is, and the more susceptible it is to shock and other things. And, I shouldn't be speaking about this when we have a doctor that is our guest that's obviously going to have a lot more knowledge on this type of thing than we do. But one of the things I think that makes catching up, there's both negatives and positives. The negative is that whenever you're using a fly rod and a fly, I think you're subjecting the fish to more stress in the battle, because it's not like you're using a broomstick and bringing them in right away and real overly heavy tackle. So it's more of an enjoyment for the fisherman, obviously, than it is for the fish. Where we can experience the battle that comes. It's different with a fly rod than anything else, and it's what makes people love fly fishing. I think one of the reasons it makes them. But the positive in all this is that you're using a single hook. You're not using a treble. You're not risking the fish in the same way, and you can bring the fish along the boat and have a much better chance of releasing the lure without bringing the fish into the boat. So I think this is a real positive. And there was a study, Dave, that, and I wish I could be more specific right now, but I wasn't prepared for this. But there was a study done a year or two ago by biologists in conjunction with the DEC and the U.S. Department of Fish and Wildlife on the survival of muskies in different water temperature conditions. And the result of this study was, and it was dumbfounding to me, is that and they took temperature variances from 60 degrees all the way to 85 degrees, and they found that in studying the muskies that were released and being able to track them or whatever, there was the exact same survival rate of fish battled and taken in 85-degree water as it was in cooler water, which goes against everything that we would think. And we have a friend that is an adamant muskie chaser in this area. His name is Chris Lasham. He's a young guy that Dave and I have both fished with several times, and he's very bright, and he also is very obsessed with catching muskies. And to the point where he loves that species just like we do, and like our buddy Russ does, who does everything to assure their survival. Well, Chris stopped fishing in the summer. He shifted his whole fishing in the heat of the summer, because we're catching these fish in small tributaries that don't have 50 feet of water, that has cooler temperatures in the bottom, where the fish can sort of at least have a better chance that way. And Chris stopped fishing for him. This was before this study, and I still think the study didn't change his habits. But the other thing that I wanted to mention is that I've noticed that in catching northern pike, and my friend Russ that we talked about, we had some sensational days this last summer where we would catch northern pike and bass, largemouth bass, under the same conditions. And it was in the summertime where the water temperature was warm, their metabolism, their energy level was at the tops. The northern pike fought incredibly. They were leaping out of the water like muskies, and really, and these were big ones. These were 10-pound plus northern pike. As the water temperature got colder, the bass still seemed to give us a great fight, but the fight of the northern pike and the muskie really diminished more. And the reason I'm saying this is I believe strongly that your best chance of catching a northern pike or maybe even a muskie is earlier in the season when the water temperature is colder, when the fish will be less of a battle.
Yeah.
But boy, I'll tell you what, if you were to come up here in May, the month of May, now I'm talking about northern pike, and Dave, is it one, you can't catch and release muskies in May, even in the tributaries. The season is a bit different, isn't it? In our tributaries.
Yeah, they're talking about changing it, but and we'll have to look it up to be sure. But I think the season in the tributaries of the St. Lawrence above the first barrier impassable to fish for muskies starts on the third, or maybe it's the last. I guess it's the last Saturday in May. So you actually have a little bit of a head start. Otherwise, the general season on the St. Lawrence is a month later. It starts on the same day that bass opens up. So that's like the third Saturday in June. So you've got about a 3-week head start, and that time period during that head start is actually a really good period for catching both muskies and pike.
Right.
And I would think, if you're really looking to do it with a fly rod, I think that would be a great time to do it. On a side note, Russ came and fished with me down here on Cuba Lake. We have a pretty large population of pickerel. And he came, brought his fly rod, brought lures flies that he thought would work well. And we went down to the north end of the lake, which is a very shallow area with a lot of weeds and lily pads. And although at the time he came in the spring, was early May, right after season had opened up, and he right off hooked one with a fly rod, and it broke him off. And he was lamenting the fact that he only had 2 of those particular flies, and he put the second one on, and we were actually also looking for crappies and whatever else we could find at the time. So, and we did get into a bunch of crappies, and then he went back to fishing with the fly again, and he hooked another pickerel, and he got it in, and he was having trouble getting the hook out. So I was helping him, and I said, "Oh, by the way," I said, "Do you want your other fly back?" Because that pickerel had the first fly still hooked in his mouth, so he got his fly back. But
Well, I think an important thing too with it, you're talking about these timings and to remember as well as the spawning period and the water temperatures that are critical for that for both pike and muskie when they start to turn on, and that's an interesting factor as well. And they're a little different for both, as you know. They're related species, obviously, but their timing's a little bit different when they spawn, and the whole spawning process is fascinating too, where they just drop sticky eggs in a shallow area that's all dead weeds, and they're lurking in those shallow waters at that time. It's very fascinating.
Well, it's interesting that you bring this up because the tributaries that Dave is talking about that flow into the St. Lawrence River, and once upon a time, I imagine the muskies, how they came to be in these tributaries was they came up from the St. Lawrence. But the muskies in these tributaries, completely different looking fish than the muskies that are out in the St. Lawrence River. They have different markings. So they're a isolated population that does not return to the St. Lawrence because of that first impoundment that Dave is talking about. But several years ago, there was a professor, he was a doctor, biologist, that was located up here. His name, I won't get into his name right now, but his philosophy was that northern pike were always going to dominate in any body of water that northern pike and muskies were in, because the northern pike spawned first, and so the little northern pike could feed on the muskie fry when they spawn later. And so always, that if the two shared the same water, the northern pike were going to dominate. Well, in these tributaries, where there once was a considerable population of northern pike, the muskies have taken over, and the muskies have dominated, and basically forced the northern pike out in many instances. Now, over the past few years, it seems like there's a resurgence in the population of northern pike in the Grass River and maybe some of these other tributaries that years ago you would never catch a northern pike in these waters. And I used to have this conflict of conversation with this doctor about this, because I was fishing these trips and muskies rule. And the muskies in these tributaries really do rule. And we talked about flies. I don't know if Dave's memory is astounding. So he probably remembers the fly that Rust was using. And I know one of the things that Rust always likes to use is a Clouser minnow. And I don't know if that was the fly he was using for the pickerel or not. And the interesting thing here, and Dave can really talk about this more, but we have a friend that also is a doctor, and he lived in he probably still lives in Long Lake, he's just retired, but he has become a muskie fanatic only with a fly rod, that's all, but he ties his own flies. And if you saw the flies that he uses, Scott, you would think that this is a joke. They look like clown flies. They're that long. The feathers go. Honestly, they look like somebody's hat or something. And yet the muskie, I don't know what the muskies think they are, but they certainly think there's something they want to kill, because he does fantastic with these big flies. Now, to fish these big flies, you got to have heavy fly rod, because how else are you going to cast them? Because they're so big. The flies that I've caught muskies on have been they've been similar to what my favorite bait in the world is, which is a bucktail jig tied the same length. So let's say 4 or 5 inches long. That's what a tandem muskie streamer. And there's probably lots of other things that work. One other thing before it goes out of my mind that I was talking about is, it appears to me, through all my life's fishing, that orange is a deadly color in the spring for muskies and northern pike in particular, orange color. And it's not just because that's the only color I use. The orange hydra is something that I will put against anything in the world for northern pike. Maybe it's because I fish it in a way that they like, I don't know. But even when Alejandro came up and we were doing the shows with the Pittsburgh Steelers, I had a hydra, and Alejandro was an avid fisherman, but they were hitting that hydra 5-1, 6-1 over any other quote pike lure. So the same thing is applied to me with streamers and flies and bucktail jigs. In the spring, I really like orange and red and white, the traditional pike colors in the spring. But as it gets into the summer and into the fall, I've never done nearly as well on the color orange that I do in the spring. And that's for all species. I don't know. I don't know if, Dave, you've got ideas on that, but that's one of the things that I want. If you were coming to fish for me, and we fish with me, not for me, if you were coming to fish with me for northern pike, I would suggest you use an orange or a red and white fly. Black is good no matter what, pike and muskies love black. Anyway, Dave.
Yeah, I would agree with orange. The orange has always been sort of my go-to color. Even when I was sort of modifying some of the hydra heads that I had and attaching an orange body that was sort of semi-clear orange, that worked pretty well, or orange and white even worked quite well. One comment I did want to make, though, you were talking about Mike that from Long Lake that fly fishes, and Scott might be interested, because I know, Scott, you were asking me about what to fish out of. And
Yes.
I think we sort of settled on a kayak as maybe being the most versatile piece of equipment you might be able to have if you were going to come to the North Country to fish, simply because you could put it in so many more places than a larger boat. The one point I would make is that Mike, that Don was talking about, fishes almost exclusively out of a kayak, but he's attached an outrigger, and I'm not sure whether it's an outrigger that came with the particular kayak that he has, but it basically gives him the ability to stand in his kayak. And so you can find him on smaller streams with his kayak, standing up, casting with the fly rod. And I think that's something to consider as you're thinking about equipment, is that outrigger can provide a degree of stability that you may not get otherwise. Rust and I fished a lot, and in fact, Don came and fished with me. I created an outrigger I have an old Grumman aluminum canoe.
Oh, yes.
And I created an outrigger because it was not the most stable canoe that I've ever had, but I created the outrigger, which made it possible for us to actually stand on occasion in that canoe as we fished some of the smaller bodies of water. The other comment I would make is with the kayak, and I wanted to talk about equipment a little bit because I think in your particular instance, it would give you an opportunity that you might have otherwise. You could go to the St. Lawrence, and there are tons of kind of protected bays that you can get to. You don't need a boat launch to put a kayak in, and you can get to those areas, some of which Don and I have fished over the years in waders. And in the spring, right after Northern Pike season opens, after that first, it's typically first Saturday in May. Those quiet bays can be a perfect place to go. And Don and I don't know about Don, I've never tried fly fishing for pike in those areas, but I have to believe that they would be just as enthusiastic about chasing as a fly as they are about chasing the other lures that we tend to throw at them. I don't know, Don, what do you think?
Oh, yeah, it will be.
Here's my feeling on that, Dave, and I was thinking about it as you were talking. I agree with you totally. Number one, the way I fish most of the time, Scott, is I wade. I get in these same places with chest waders. Hardly anybody else will do what I do because I'm in the water, I'm in muck, and I wade along the cattails, and I can control my speed this way in wading. I find it very, very incredibly rewarding for me. And I can do that in the spring because that's where the fish are. They're in these places. But I think one of the biggest limitation of fly fishing for pike or muskie isn't so much the offering itself, because a streamer can look just as tantalizing or more so than almost anything else. It's your ability to cover the water the same way. You can't cast as far with a fly as somebody that can cast out, and so you're not bringing that fly back through as much water each time. And pike and muskies are both followers, so a lot of times they may follow a long ways before they strike, and they don't have that ability to follow so far because all of a sudden they're right on you. Now, in a muskie's case, they don't care. I've had muskies come within a foot of me and strike because they could give a darn if I'm there in the water with them. They have no fear of me, and that's actually the truth. And that I had this happen this year, but I think that's one of the biggest limitations is just your ability to cover the same amount of water. Now, Dave is talking about these bays, and one of the bays that Russ and Dave has fished this bay several times with us, but Russ mentioned on the phone to me yesterday when I told him about you, is our favorite cove, Dave. And I won't name the first name of the cove, but our cove it's a finger of water that comes in from the St. Lawrence, maybe several hundred yards in from where the St. Lawrence is, and it's narrow. You can, if you position your kayak, canoe, whatever, in the middle of this finger of water, you can almost with a long cast either side. And so Rust came in a year ago. He was alone in his canoe with a fly rod, and he said he had one of the greatest days of catching northern pike on that day in that cove with his fly rod. And you know, Rust is not using giant flies like Mike Small does, the avid bass fish or muskie fisherman I told you that does his flies. So and he isn't using 10-foot fly rods. He's using probably an 8 or 8.5 foot 7 weight, or an 8 foot or a 9 foot 7 weight fly rod would do just about everything that you would want to do. It'll give you the joy of the fight. It'll cast as far as you need to cast, a moderate sized streamer. And the biggest thing also is, and Dave is far more of an expert on this than I would be, but is the leader that you would use, because pike and muskies are obviously going to cut the line very like Russ Pickerel did with the fly that he's talking about. Fluorocarbon is always better than mono in that it's more abrasion resistant. But what suggestions do you have there, Dave? Because you use fluorocarbon even with a spinning rod for a musky leader rather than wire leader.
Yeah, I became a fan of fluorocarbon as a musky leader quite some time ago. First of all, it's got the same refractive qualities as water, so it essentially disappears in the water. And so I tried a number of different sizes in fluorocarbons, and I create my own leaders at this point. And I create, depending on what I'm fishing for, if I'm fishing for pickerel down here, I'll use a 20-pound fluorocarbon and create leaders for the pickerel, because they don't seem to cut 20-pound. Pike don't seem to cut anything. I would probably, if I was going to zero in on one in particular one, I'd probably use 40 pounds for pike. But I typically use 80 pounds for muskies, and I have never had a muskie cut me off. And I've caught a lot of muskies on that 40-pound or that 80-pound fluorocarbon leader, as opposed to a wire leader, which invariably tend to kink at some point. Not that a fluorocarbon leader doesn't have to be replaced once in a while, but I've had them last much longer than the wire leaders that I've tried to use, and I'm convinced that they're less visible to the fish.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting you talk about the leaders. I mean, I've done an enormous amount of research over the years, leaders for different species and setups and things, and you know, the choices are overwhelming. First of all, there's so many people do different things, you know, and then but back to the pike, you know, the interesting you use the fluoro instead of wire. Steve Pogo Pike, Steve Pogozinski in Connecticut also promotes the, you know, using a fluoro heavyweight leader at the end instead of wire, and his setup's pretty cool in terms of the castability of the fly, and I'm sure your setups and leaders, which I'd love to learn about. You know, there's a lot to how casting those big flies, you know, and having it turn over properly when you're casting it out, you know.
Yeah. Well, the other interesting thing is when you start playing with fluorocarbon, you start. I discovered anyway. You start studying knots a little more than you might have otherwise,
sure.
because in particular, 80-pound fluorocarbon is somewhat tougher to tie than some others, and you also want to figure out how to, you know, what your bait's going to be attached to at the other end. Yep. And if you don't want a hook to, I'm trying to think of what the term would be, but you know, if you don't want to put a hook on the end because you don't want that to be an additional visible thing, if you want to tie it directly to the line, you want something that's not going to impact the action of the fly that you're using. And I've told them to a cray knot. Mm-hmm. And it's pretty easy to tie and pretty easy to look up online, and it provides the flexibility to that lure, so that you've got a permanent loop there that allows that bait to wobble a little bit. But I found that when I was creating musky leaders, it was important because the Grass River in particular, but also the other rivers that we fished in the North Country, have involved some moss and weeds and other things that if the cut end of the knot aims in the wrong direction, you're going to pick up more weeds than if you develop or tumble to a knot that the cut end faces not in the direction that you're trying to draw that lure through. So even as I said, the knots become almost critically important with respect to.
Isn't it interesting? One little tiny outpost, little edge of a knot or the end of a tie, what it can catch on. I mean, you know, whether you're dealing with wires or fly line or suture in the operating room, it's all, knots can be the bane of your existence and can cause you can have good days and bad days.
And there's so many choices out there that it's exactly. There's no way I've become an expert, but I have settled on a couple that I'm most comfortable tying and seem to work well for me. But
I've been a surgeon for over 31 years, and sewing and suturing and knot tying has been my life. But that's in a certain way. When it comes to fishing and knots, because I haven't spent 40 or 50 days a year fishing, I have to keep those apps on my phone for the fishing knots to go back and remind myself when it's been several months since I tied that knot last, to make sure to remind myself to do it. But thank God for modern technology, right?
Yes.
Speaking of tying knots, Scott, do you tie flies? Have you ever dabbled into that type of thing?
I have the equipment, and it's, again, one of those things on my bucket list to do, as I've winding down my career in medicine. My daughter, I have 3 children, and my oldest is, she's my best fly fishing partner in all the world. I got her involved in fly fishing when she was 12, and she went to veterinary medical school out in Colorado State, and we went to the International Fly Show there a few years back and sat down with at a fly tying class, and it got started, and she ties some, and it's something I have the equipment for and need to get to as I get more time to do it, but it's definitely something I want to do.
Well, I would imagine that the best muskie or northern pike fly is yet to be tied. I mean, the imagination can come up with all kinds of things, and what I wanted to tell you was years ago, and again, I for some reason that phrase seems to be coming to my lips often, and I'm not sure why. It either means I'm getting much older, or that some of these great things happened years ago. But I remember reading it at the time in it was a magazine that I don't think is still available, but they were talking about catching giant northern pike in the St. Lawrence River near Kingston, Ontario. And they were using these giant, these long flies tied out of some kind of jig material. And somewhere along the line, I know it wasn't my idea, was to use horsehair.
Yep, I knew you were going to say it. I was going to bring that up.
Well, the horsehair jigs that I used at the time, and my buddy Louis somehow got these jigs made, and where he found the horsehair long enough, it had to come from their mane or tail or whatever. And we started using these long horsehair jigs, and I'm standing here with my fingers separated, but I would say some of them were up to 12 inches long.
Yeah.
But just with the hook tied at one end, not in tandem or not with a leader, so that you had a hook near the end of it. It seemed like the fish would always strike them at the head anyway. So we experimented with different colors, and believe me, these horsehair jigs and these long sizes were just as deadly for big pike as they were for muskies. And the biggest muskie I've ever caught in my life was caught in the Grass River many years ago in November on a horsehair jig. And unfortunately, that fish was killed, and it was weighed at one of our weigh centers, and it was an ounce less than 40 pounds. That's an awful big fish caught in the Grass River. It was caught on this horsehair jig. But what we found was, or what I found, was that when the color of that mane or the horsehair got lighter and lighter, the fish reacted less and less to it. So black and dark brown would work great. Blondish colors, I couldn't get a strike with. And I would think, oh, wow, that's going to look like a fish of some kind. The fish really preferred those dark colors. And I would think a streamer tied the same way. The only difference is you didn't have a lead head sinking it, but would really work well. But I guess the main thing I was referring to, though, was coloration. And coloration can make such a huge difference. One other, Dave and I have talked about stories and the impact that stories can have. And I want to tell you now, and everybody that happens to be watching or listening, a story that I had. One of my trips to do a rod and reel streamside show was to Reindeer Lake in Manitoba. And Reindeer Lake is a really big, vast, almost like a Great Lake. And our guides were Cree Indians at the time, and I remember one of them, his name was George Sinclair, and I was we really became friends. And he took me to this place. My goal was to catch giant northern pike on a fly. And so they had all kinds of bays, and it seemed like always the bays were the farthest from the camp. We had to travel the farthest way to get our fish. But we went to this bay. The water was pretty clear. And the lessons, and we were using bunny flies at the time in different colors. And I remember we'd start in the morning, and it was a day where the sunlight was pretty significant, where you could really see the fly. And one of the things that came from that day is we'd start out, and there would be big northerns. We're talking about northerns that would approach 20 pounds, but 15-pound northerns that were our target. And these fish were, and they were near along the shoreline and the cattails or whatever the reeds were, and you could watch them come out and react to the fly. And the thing that became so clear to us was that, let's say at 8 o'clock in the morning, a black fly was the only thing that would get these fish to come and react, to do anything. At 10 o'clock in the morning, all of a sudden, they wouldn't look at a black fly, but a white one now became their favorite. And then an hour or two later, it became yellow or chartreuse. And this has always stayed with me. Their preferences and how they reacted, whether they showed any interest or not, changed. And I don't think it was just sunlight that was affecting how they perceived the color. I think it was more of a actual color deviation that would motivate them or not motivate them. And just passing that story along. Did I catch giant pike on a fly? I guess I caught, I've been luckier than most people in the world, that I've had the opportunity to go to different places that most of us would never have the time or the money or the ability to do that. I was able to do that in doing the show. And so I got to experience some amazing things that I'm just blessed with having that. And one of those experiences, we're able to go to places where there were great big northern pike and have a chance to try to catch them on a fly. I have one other little story that now I'm monopolizing everything, but I remember going up to Lake Athabasca, where the biggest lake trout in the world seemed to live, and people would go there to try to catch these big lake trout. Well, mixed in with the lake trout in the same bays would be giant northern pike. Mm-hmm. And so our quest was to try to catch an hour. My guest at that time was John Clark, who lives in this area, and was a wrestling coach and the athletic director for one of our colleges. But John Clark he became obsessed with catching them on a fly, and he caught several really big ones. But here's the story that I wanted to tell. You got these monster northerns with their big fangs and everything, and then you've got these blunt, unappreciated big lake trout in the same water. And I said to our guide, I said, so which is the toughest? Which would win in a fight? The northern pike or the lake trout? Knowing down well the northern pike were going to dominate. And he just laughed and he said, the lake trout just demolished the northern pike. The northern pike don't have a prayer with a lake trout around. Because I guess what the lake trout do is they will charge them at full speed and ram them in the side and kill them or blunt them or do whatever that way. But there were two predators, and the dominant predator was not the northern pike, it was the lake trout. So I've always remembered that too because that went against everything that I ever imagined.
Well, I sent you that. I think. Well, I know Dave has it. I sent you the picture of my lake trout on the fly. Um, from the Fulton chain ice out. It's a great time to be out after that predator when they're in shallow waters. And it's interesting. The Fulton chain of lakes has, not just the lake trout. They harbor their own nice northern pike population, which I've yet to catch on a fly, and a couple of the lakes even have tiger muskie, which is another species related that plays some role too. That's interesting.
I know Dave and his wife one summer camped on Lake Durant. You know where Lake Durant is?
Yeah, yep.
And Dave caught tiger muskies there. I don't think well, I have. I've caught tiger muskies in the St. Lawrence. They aren't supposed to be there in the buyout. I don't know what is going on, but that's a whole nother story. But I know Dave caught tiger muskies up there.
I caught one. Let's not get carried away here.
Well, as we know, they are DEC dependent because they're sterile; they don't reproduce. Yeah. So, but it's interesting that they can survive, and we even have a few areas right around here on the Mohawk River where there's supposedly healthy populations. But I'm not even sure now how if the DEC is still putting them in waters. I'm not seeing anything in recent last couple of years in their literature or documentation to indicate that they're still stocking them, but I don't know that for sure.
And I don't either. I think they are, but I don't know that for sure either. But I know down where Dave lives, one of the lakes there has a population of tiger muskies in it. And I recently saw ice fishing reports on that lake and how people were flocking to that lake to catch tiger muskies through the ice because it's legal to fish them in the winter, whereas it isn't legal to fish native muskies or whatever we're talking about. They're protected through the winter. And they're very susceptible to ice fishermen coming into their area because the tiger muskies just don't go and hibernate in the winter. They're aggressive and they're active. And I know the biggest muskie that I've ever seen in my life was caught just downriver from Messina by one of the guys that owned a bait shop. Messina is no longer there. But that muskie was so huge that maybe Dave, you remember that muskie that was it was like bigger than the world record type of thing. It really was. It's monster muskie caught through the ice.
Yes.
And I always hate the thought of it because I just can't think that those fish aren't subjected to more stress brought up through a hole in the ice and temperatures below zero. I don't know that. Scott, you might know better, but I don't know how easy it is to be able to release these fish and have them survive.
It's an interesting concept because you think about how poorly you and I, as a human being, handle cold water temperatures just in a matter of a few minutes. If we're in, 50-degree water, we're in big trouble, especially if we're in deep water where we can't get out, with hypothermia. But, different species and different temperature spectrum, it'd be interesting to know how their muscles are working at different water temperatures. We know they slow down, obviously, but are they as compromised as we are, in cold water?
But after ice out is also for these northern pike that we're talking about. That's a great time because they're the most vulnerable because they're in areas where we can reach them. Where the average person with a canoe, 2 legs like I have that I can wade in this area, or a kayak can get to some of these secluded areas where it isn't as dangerous water, where you're not out in the main currents or so forth, and that's where these fish have come in to spawn. And so there's a bay near Messina, and I'm not bringing up Messina for any other reason than that it's become the center of fishing opportunity of people coming up to the North Country because Messina's sort of become a depot, an area where they can use as their center and then go up. But there's a big bay right near the Messina beach. It's a huge sort of inlet water, and there's a dike that runs along this bay. And what I did, I remember going on walking along that dike with Linda, and we'd look down. I remember one year looking down, and when I say down, maybe 50 feet to the water's edge and out in the water, and I kept saying, I don't remember logs here. It's rocky, and I'd see this, and they were these great big northerns that were laying there motionless, and you could actually see. So anyway, one of the years, maybe let's say 3 or 4 years ago, I decided that this was a place I was going to try for northern. It was treacherous wading because there was a lot of broken rock there where they built the dike along there, and it's really tough wading on all that variable rock. But anyway, I remember wading there using the hydra, the orange hydra, and I caught some really big northern pike. And I took Russ there, the person we're talking about, one time, and again we were wading, and he was taken back by the follows that he was getting of big fish. We're talking 30-inch fish. It didn't take. So that is an area that if you came and put your kayak in, there's a number of people in our area that are northern pike fishermen that know about this bay, and they go in there with their boats. But there's a lot of water there. I know you would have an opportunity of catching them on a fly. And the handy thing is, unlike when you're waiting, I love that. I can control my speed. I can control where I cast. I can control how long I stay in one spot. But the beauty of having a kayak to go through that water is you can cover a lot more of that water. And those pike may be way out of casting range because it is a big bay. And it's all basically the same depth. So, like Dave said earlier, there's places like that, but I know specific places where we know the northerns come in that time of the year. I don't know how long they stay, but they're usually there through the month of May. And there's lots more. So, again, we've kind of gone in a circle here, and we've come back to where we started with talking about opportunities for people like you from another part of the state that have always wanted to have the opportunity to catch a northern pike on a fly. This is a great place to do that. It's not that you can't go to any of these other lakes in the state and do it, because you can. Northern pike are northern pike, and they have certain habits. But we spent, and I've spent a good part of my life up here. Northern pike are my favorite fish, and I've told Dave this, and I got Dave involved with catching giant pickerel because there actually are giant pickerel that live only in, and I think, the bays of Lake Ontario. We don't have any pickerel up here in these bays of the St. Lawrence River. The pickerel that don't come past a certain point. There's no pickerel in the tributaries we're talking about. But if you just go a few miles away, there are pickerel in some of these other waters. But for some reason, in the bays of Lake Ontario, they grow to be bigger than they do almost any place in the Northeast. And so 5-pound pickerel are not uncommon. And they're a fabulous fish to go for. And so Dave and I started going to Henderson Harbor, which gave us the access, and that's a whole other story. But there is another way to catch pike-like fish, again, another cousin of the muskie, on a fly. And so we have opportunities up here I think you wouldn't get in a lot of other areas. And that's why we sort of highlight the North Country as being, I think, a fisherman's mecca. And I think, I've traveled all over the country doing the shows that I did for 20 years, from not just the country, the continent, fished some of the greatest locations. But after doing that for so long, I remember approaching Dave and saying, Dave, I would love to tell the story of what this area is.
So Scott, is there I really wanted to ask the question, is there any burning question that you have, something you really want to know that you came to this session and wanted to ask that you didn't ask?
Well, first, I'm just looking forward to maybe a chance to get to fish with you guys at some point. Up in Messina and down in Cayuga Lake, that's one thing. And then I posed a question, and I knew you were going to answer it later, which was fine. And maybe with this, you think about the hydra, and you look at a lot of modern stuff we have, plastic baits like the Kitech stuff. Looks very similar, but what do you think separates the hydra from those baits that make it maybe more attractive than a Kitech swim bait with a wobbly tail or something of that nature.
Yeah, Don's going to probably answer the question better than I can, but I wanted to slip something in. When you look at the Hydra, I have to admit, when I first saw it, I thought, oh, what an ugly bait. It really, the appearance is, I guess, deceiving, because I never really thought it was particularly appealing until we used it. And Don talked about Loch Holt, where we went for the landlocked salmon, and we were basically, I remember as we were headed up there, somebody from the company showed up, met us at the Canadian border with a bag of heads, and that's all we had were heads. We had no bodies to go with them. Don had a bunch of bodies in his tackle that we used. They were just
for other things.
Yeah, they were just flukes and paddle-tailed shad that got attached. And if you look at some of the older videos that Don had, you'll see that it's a commercial body just stuck on the back of this head. So I always thought it was really ugly, but for some reason, and Don's got his own opinion. I think the mechanics of this, of that head and that lip, had something to do with it being attractive. I don't know whether it vibrates at a particular frequency that piques their interest. But Don, I'll let you try to answer from your perspective.
Well, from my perspective, I think it's a number of things. I think number one might just be in our own heads. The fact that we think it's good, so we use it. And that is something for any lure, any bait, The more you believe in it, I think the more you concentrate on what you're doing and so forth. But I believe, if a fish can discern the difference between a size 22 and a 24 dry fly and can see the different colors in that thing and can decide whether they want it or not, they certainly can see differences from one lure to another. I think after spending the time that we did in swimming pools trying to get that head so that it wouldn't roll, so that it would swim, I think that probably has something to do with it. I think the reason I can use it so well is I think it's the way I use it. I don't just cast it out and reel it in. And this, I could be completely wrong. It's just the way I fish. I tend to move my rod like this, and every time I do that, you can make that lure almost walk the dog underwater. Mm-hmm. So it develops a different motion in the water than just a coming in, which sometimes good and sometimes isn't good. I think the paddle tail gives it a different look because we had another tail that was part of our delivery system that was produced, that was molded for this lure, and that's a split tail, almost like a fluke type of tail, as opposed to the paddle tail. I think the paddle tail works better. I don't know. Also, since it has a lip, it's not just going to go to the bottom like you would with a bucktail jig or something. It's actually going to develop its own motion. And Scott, I want to really thank you for joining us today. And you've only opened up my wonder and my enthusiasm to go other places and to learn things from you like we learn from everybody that we fish with. I hope all of you out there have enjoyed listening to us today, and we'll see you here soon on another UpNorthNY chat.
Thanks so much, guys.